every so often you've got to ask yourself, hey, I can't be the first one to have noticed this. I can't be the only person to have figured this out. I had the observation when reading Bernie Sanders' book. This is a book which is obviously to some extent his set of campaign promises, his platform for the upcoming elections, and it's in some respects it's reflecting back on the elections before, the elections he was basically shut out of by Hillary Clinton and the corrupt Democrat Party machine. It struck me as obvious and yet everywhere ignored that Bernie Sanders supports the same policy as Donald Trump on trade and tariffs. Now, to disclose my bias here, if I had a choice between voting for Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, I would vote for Bernie Sanders. It's somewhat hilarious to me that people presume I'm a conservative or even that I'm right-wing because I engage in the critique of Bernie Sanders. Guys, you really need incisive and productive critique within the left. Otherwise, things go off the rails real quick. But anyway, what I hear out of the left wing right now, for example, from the Young Turks are one of the most influential left of center news organizations in the world. The Young Turks are again and again attacking Donald Trump's tariff policy, basically what we call a protectionist policy. Irony of ironies. All of a sudden, a left-wing outlet like the Young Turks are pro-free trade, are pro-neoliberal. It's not what you guys were like when Obama was in power. It's not what you guys were like when you were looking at the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, or anything else. All of a sudden, because it's convenient to oppose Donald Trump on the tariff issue, they're against tariffs. Well, if you think this policy is bad and evil and wrong when Donald Trump does it, you must believe it's still bad and evil and wrong when Bernie Sanders does it. Now, the basic promise, the basic approach Bernie Sanders has is to punish China and punish Mexico for the fact that during the last 20 years, under conditions of globalized free trade, more and more industry has left the United States of America to relocate to precisely China and Mexico. Those are the two biggest players in the game. They're the two that will make the biggest difference. There are some others. Obviously, Japan is also a major trading partner of the United States. But it's no coincidence that it is mostly against China and Mexico that both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump speak. They're both very elderly men. They're both men who can remember what Detroit was. Detroit, Michigan used to be a huge center of cars. There's a funny quip going around. I don't know who coined this. In the past, they made cars in Flint, Michigan. And if you went to Mexico, it wasn't safe to drink the tap water. And today, it's the other way around. Today, they make cars in Mexico. And if you go to places like Flint, Michigan, it's near Detroit, the water isn't safe to drink. So the deindustrialization of the United States of America is a major part of the odyssey, just for this whole generation, for guys who are this age, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump. People like them, for them, it's still fundamentally odd and jarring that Americans are carrying around cellular phones that are manufactured in China, that they're driving cars manufactured in Mexico. Again, we could add Japan to this list of trade rivals. And they see a lot of advantages in returning to a tariff regime that would protect American industry, thus the term protectionism. Now, I remember just a couple of years ago looking into what Bernie Sanders' policy was on immigration and illegal immigration. So this was at the time when Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, and what's her name again? Hillary Clinton, when they were all viably contesting, who was going to be president when that race was still going on. And of course, it was interesting to see that Hillary Trump really conceded the point on the border wall dispute. That at a time when Donald Trump was really making his major campaign promise, quote unquote, build the wall, Hillary Clinton basically responded by saying that yes, in the past, she had voted for building a barrier of some kind at the border, whether it be a fence or a wall, that she also would build the wall. And it seemed to me Bernie Sanders was avoiding the point, or that nobody really knew what Bernie Sanders' position was. And I remember clicking through several pages of his website to get to what his campaign promise really was. What was Bernie Sanders' position on this? And again, there was no significant difference between the sides. Bernie Sanders, he definitely had much more polite and reconciliatory and pleasant language in presenting the idea. But fundamentally, Bernie Sanders was totally opposed to illegal immigration. So again, if you think that's a bad policy, and a lot of people on the left wing do, a lot of people on the left wing today, it's very popular for them to say that they want to live in a world without borders. It's popular for them to say that they want to accept all immigrants, and even that they want to accept all illegal immigrants with open arms, that they want to allow unlimited numbers of people fleeing from Nicaragua and so on. Well, out of those three politicians I've just mentioned, there's actually no significant diversity in what their policy position is. There's only a difference in rhetoric. So on this same issue, coming back to the issue of trade and tariffs, I had not really even a debate, I had a conversation with someone who's more of a stereotypical left-winger than myself on the internet the other day. And he was laying into Donald Trump on tariffs, saying that somehow tariffs are evil. Since when was it left-wing to think tariffs are evil, since it became convenient to insult Donald Trump? And I just paused at him and said, look, I understand why you're saying this. Right now, nobody likes Donald Trump. He's very unpopular. But are you aware that Bernie Sanders would fundamentally do the same thing? Bernie Sanders is looking to create tariff barriers between China and the United States and Mexico to protect American industry, to help, as he said, help, quote unquote, the working class, help the middle class, this sort of thing. And the guy's response was telling. He said to me, well, yeah, but if Bernie Sanders did it, he wouldn't be gross and crude and offensive in doing it. It wouldn't be a bunch of angry tweets on Twitter. If Bernie Sanders did it, it would be kind of statesmanlike and respectful. Now, there is some truth to that. But guys, if this is a matter of principle, then I think we have to have the maturity and detachment to say, as a matter of principle, either the policy is right or it's wrong, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton who is advancing the policy. Now, on the question of whether or not tariffs are always bad or always evil, or always economically disadvantageous, this is the other question. There's a really interesting example in the news right now. Many economists are arguing, and they're arguing persuasively, that the sanctions, the trade sanctions imposed on Russia, have had more of a positive effect on the Russian economy than a negative effect. So to be clear, the argument of people who support neoliberalism and most people who support neoconservatism, the argument of those people is that more free trade is always better, that the whole economy will optimize, it will benefit the country more. So if you really believe in neoliberalism, if you really believe in free trade, then you look at the United States and say, look, on the whole, it's better that American people have the freedom to buy cars imported from Mexico, cars imported from China, partly, of course, because those cars will be cheaper. You should just allow free trade, allow the free market to sort itself out. And a protectionist would say, no. It's actually important and worthwhile to set up barriers to force American people or to encourage American people to buy cars manufactured in the United States because that's in the national interest, blah, blah, blah. It builds up and sustains industry and certain types of jobs and employment within the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So neither theory will ever be entirely discredited. I just note, empirically, neither theory can ever be entirely right nor entirely wrong. And we have a really interesting example in the current sanctions on Russia. So sanctions, one of the main things that makes them different from tariffs is that Russia didn't choose to cut itself off from world trade. Russia invaded the Ukraine. Russia did a series of politically objectionable things, including the invasion and occupation of territory that was legally part of a different country, the Ukraine. And the whole world sat around and wrung its hands and said, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to punish Russia for this, or what's going to be the response? And the decision was, rather than starting a war, rather than kicking Russia out of the United Nations, there are various things they could have done, rather than ceasing to recognize Russia, the government of Russia as a legitimate government country. There are different diplomatic things you could do. You could close all your embassies, bring them out. You could say, we don't recognize Vladimir Putin as the legitimate government of Russia. There are different ways to respond. They say, okay, the way they're going to respond to this is by cutting off trade. And it's interesting to note that this happened on a legislative level separately in several different places. So, for example, that was a totally different debate in Japan. Japan has a border with Russia. A lot of people forget that. Trade between Japan and Russia is very important. So Japan had one political response to it. The European Union had another. The United States had another. I don't know. I don't know about India, for example. That would be interesting to look into. How did India respond to this? Territorial sovereignty versus free trade. So these trade sanctions, these limits to trade, were imposed with everyone absolutely assuming they would have a devastating impact or a negative impact on Russia. Now, inevitably, of course, they must have some negative impact. If you cut off trade, there must be some negative impact. For example, if you cut off trade with Mexico, cars within the United States will become more expensive. That's going to impact some people's lives negatively. If you cut off trade with Japan and China, not just cars will be more expensive, things like cellular phones, kitchen appliances. We buy so much stuff that's manufactured, assembled, and so on in China and Japan. And also, of course, consumer choice becomes narrower. So there are very obvious disadvantages. But economists, crunching the numbers and looking at how the Russian economy reacted, Russia is a huge internal market. And as you can imagine, when they ceased to be able to import, for example, certain types of food, their agricultural sector sprung to life and started providing more competitive foodstuffs for within the Russian economy. That apparently across the board in Russia, various industries, various productive segments of the economy have had new life and vitality breathed into them. Now, obviously, there must be some sectors of the economy that have suffered, that have lost jobs, that have closed down. But there were serious discussions that overall this was a net benefit. Now, I think the main argument in favor of the neoliberal trade regime, neoliberal world order, is basically an argument about the limits of human intelligence. And boy, Donald Trump is an example of that. You know, Donald Trump tried previously to set up tariffs that would optimize the aluminum industry, the steel industry, trying to make barriers to the movement of these specific metals. And it was very debatable. Is Donald Trump himself capable of making the decision about what is really in America's best interest in steel and aluminum? It was very technical. It's very difficult to do. And then when you go through all the other sectors of the economy, is it really in America's interest to cut off trade in oranges? And then when you scale it up and look at trade as a world-spanning system, if each and every country is engaging in these kinds of protectionist decisions, one of the famous examples was Japan blocking the import of hockey sticks and sports equipment from Canada. Canadian government was disputing this, as you can imagine. Another example is, the bizarre legal machinations surrounding New Zealand's dairy industry. A whole other story. New Zealand wanting to export their dairy products to the whole world and this kind of thing. And a lot of countries saying no, they want to protect their own dairy market. It's ridiculous. Okay, but anyway, if every country is trying to make ad hoc strategic decisions in their own best interest, for one thing, some of those decisions won't really be in their best interest. Like, we thought we'd improve things by cutting off the trade in steel so we'd produce more steel of our own, but the actual knock-on effects turned out to be this, and this. There were unforeseen effects for various industries, or it ends up cutting you off from certain exports you wanted to make. It really is a kind of, the argument for unlimited free trade is basically keep it simple, stupid. If Canada and Japan come to an agreement and say, look, Japan, we're gonna let you export all of your special goods, the special goods you create that are uniquely Japanese to Canada, and the Canadian people can buy your stuff, and you have to let us export the few things we're really good at. We make better hockey sticks than you in Japan, and there are enough people playing ice hockey in Japan that they want to buy these things. And let things sort themselves out. However, this is now the year 2019. That argument sounded a lot more persuasive before we all saw exactly what unfolded in Detroit, Michigan. It's for exactly people of this generation, Bernie Sanders' generation, who can see what happened to the whole American economy. In a perfect world, could there have been a strategy for the United States making a better transition to a post-industrialized, deindustrialized society? And would that strategy actually also entail much more of a hard anti-immigration, anti-illegal immigration stance? Because if fundamentally there are fewer jobs and fewer high-quality jobs in your economy due to deindustrialization, how can you possibly match that with ever-increasing numbers of immigrants, both legal and illegal immigrants? A lot of things there don't make sense, especially if your fundamental objective is to have higher wages and better quality of life for both poor people and middle-class people, which is his agenda. So it seems to me that right now we're in a position where a lot of the assumptions that were unquestioned about neoliberalism on both the left and the right are finally falling apart, but nobody is really putting forward any coherent program or set of answers. On the contrary, a lot of what you're getting are the same policies presented in left-wing rhetoric and right-wing rhetoric. And I just heard a lecture from London School of Economics pointing out this is actually a measurable phenomenon in Europe and in North America and the whole Western world. The problem that the meaningful difference in your choice between left and right has gotten smaller and smaller in recent decades. Everyone was hoping we'd have a sudden break, we'd have new and meaningful difference after the 2008 financial crisis. That definitely has not yet happened. Okay, so summing it up, if you think about a kind of four-part logical diagram, you've got people who are pro-tariff and people who are anti-tariff. You've got people who are pro-sanctions and people who are anti-sanctions. And let me tell you, right now, within the left wing, these are hot issues. And I think if you did a poll, the mainstream left, groups like the Young Turks, the mainstream left-wing position is that any good left-wing person is anti-tariffs and also anti-sanctions. So, for example, they don't want sanctions against North Korea, they don't want sanctions against Iran, they don't want sanctions against Russia, which is a little strange. There are different kind of historical and ethical reasons for why this is. But they don't want sanctions against Cuba. There's an example that tugs at left-wing heartstrings. So, bizarrely, at a time when the left wing is saying that the people they want to support most are the working class, are manufacturing jobs, etc., the ethical positions they're committed to are 100% disadvantageous to the industrial working class. And I think it's kind of hidden in plain sight. As I say, I'm not the only one who mentioned it. Bernie Sanders' so-called populist, so-called working class platform, some people in the press have noticed this. It is, in fact, contrary to that left-wing commitment, and it's instead quite compatible with the policies now pursued by Donald J. Trump.